Good morning and welcome back to ninth grade world history. My name is Coach Spivey and we're just going to pick up right where we left off. We're looking at the third critical standard, and that standard is to describe causes and consequences of World War II. And if you remember last week we talked about the causes of World War II and then got into some of the events and obviously World War II itself. And so our focus today will be finishing up World War II, and then as we have time, look at some of the consequences. And then whatever we don't get to as far as consequences of World War II this time, we'll pick up next time on our last of 6 lessons in ninth grade world history. I do want to kind of revisit just to review some of the causes, just to refresh our memory a little bit. We said that some of the causes of World War II were the lasting effects of World War I. And that was definitely a cause of World War II. And then obviously during the 1930s, the worldwide economic Great Depression led to and was a significant cause of World War II. And then finally, some of the acts of aggression, particularly by Japan, Italy, and of course Germany, were significant causes of World War II. And then after we looked at the causes, we dove into World War II itself. And when we dove into World War II itself, it was not looking very good, right? Things looked bleak. Germany and Italy were having its way in Europe, and it looked like Japan was marching towards an easy victory in the Pacific as well. So let's revisit some of the things that we talked about in Europe. We said that the war actually started with Germany's invasion of Poland. It wasn't long after that when France fell, and the only ally left standing was Britain. And then when the Germans couldn't finish off Britain, they turned their attention both to North Africa and the Balkans, and actually went against that non-aggression treaty that they had signed with the Soviet Union and invaded Soviet Union itself. And where we left off specifically last time was the fighting in the Pacific. And because there was fighting both in Europe and the Pacific, just try to wrap your mind around the fact that there were 2 theaters, some fighting in Europe and obviously some fighting with Japan in the Pacific. And Japan looked like that they were on their way to an easy victory in the Pacific. The U.S., again, trying to stay out of the war. They originally had sent aid to China to try to help China defeat the Japanese. That didn't work. They cut oil shipments to Japan, whatever they could do to physically stay out of the war. And so where we left off was when the Japanese decided they were actually going to launch an attack on Pearl Harbor, which was now U.S. territory. And so on December the 7th, 1941, which President Roosevelt would call a date which will live in infamy, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on U.S. forces, the U.S. naval forces there at Pearl Harbor. Let me zoom in and kind of set the scene for you. So there's a couple of ways you could do this as far as stationing your naval fleet. I could put all my naval fleet real close together, right? There will be easier to defend, and I can have an eye on all of them, but they're also easier to attack as well. Or I could spread them out over the Pacific at different islands and stuff. It'd be easier, harder to defend, but also harder to take out, right? The whole fleet. Well, the U.S. had the majority of their Pacific fleet there, thinking that they could be more easily protected at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Well, because of that surprise attack, almost the entire U.S. Pacific fleet was wiped out. 19 ships sunk or damaged. 2,300 Americans lost their lives that day. And obviously, this was the event that brought the U.S. into the war. And they declared war on both Japan as well as Germany and Italy. to kind of give you a visual about where this took place, over here you have the United States, right here is Japan, and right here in the middle of the Pacific is this chain of islands that we know as Hawaii. So let me zoom in there. And Hawaii is a chain of islands, and this island right here called Oahu is home to not only the capital Honolulu, but Pearl Harbor right here. So let me zoom into Pearl Harbor. And this is what Pearl Harbor looks like even today. And they were able to line up the naval ships there along the edges of the harbor here. And this surprise attack obviously caught them by surprise and was able to take out the majority of the Pacific Fleet, as well as some of the airplanes and stuff that were on the landing strips here. If I zoom in today, you may notice that this is Pearl Harbor National Memorial. If I zoom into that, you can make out the shape and remnants of a battleship right here. And this is the USS Arizona, and it lies entombed there in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii to the day. This white thing that you see here is actually a memorial bridge. You can go visit this museum today to look not only at the entombed remains of the USS Arizona, but also a memorial to Pearl Harbor and the events there itself. So devastating attack by the Japanese that brought the U.S. into the war. Not only did they attack Pearl Harbor, but almost at the exact same time they attacked the U.S. islands of Guam and Wake Island, the British city of Hong Kong in mainland China, and further westward in Thailand. So just to give you a picture of that, obviously Pearl Harbor, but then almost at the exact same time, Wake Island and the island of Guam. They pushed further westward from French Indochina into Thailand and the British city of Hong Kong. Japan looked like it was well on its way to a victory. Then they turned their attention southward toward the U.S. island of the Philippines. Right here, the U.S. General Douglas MacArthur had to leave, swore to the people of the Philippines and the soldiers there that he would be back. We'll see if that vow comes true. And then finally, they begin to push further south into the Malay Peninsula, south of Thailand, and the city of Singapore. And they pushed further south into the islands that we know today as Indonesia, and then further westward into Burma. So the islands of Indonesia and further westward into Burma. Things look bleak for the Allies in Europe. Things look bleak for the Allies in the Pacific as well. So what happened? Well, what we'll see is that the tide began to turn. How? Let's find out. Allies began to turn the tide. First in the European theater and then the Pacific theater. If we think back, the Germans were having their way in the European theater. The reason that they didn't start in the Pacific is the U.S. fleet was almost wiped out. So as they were trying to rebuild, they knew they were going to have to fight on two fronts, so they turned their attention to the European theater first. And the Allies turned the tide in Europe. They started in North Africa. The U.S. entered the war. Russia wanted its allies to attack in France. Right? So here's the Soviet Union. Here's France. If the Allies could attack here, that would take some of the pressure off of the Soviet Union. And that's where they wanted to. But what the Allies, Great Britain and the United States, decided they would do is they would actually start here in North Africa and push through what they would call the underbelly of Europe, through southern Europe, particularly Italy. So North Africa and then Italy. So they were going to attack North Africa, southern Europe first, and the British launched an attack at what would be the Battle of El Alamein in October of 1942. I'll give you an idea where that was. Here is Egypt and the Suez Canal. They knew that they could not let the Germans get to this point and allow them access to some of the oil resources that would be there in the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf and stuff. And so this battle took place right here at El Alamein. And while that battle took place, the U.S. were building their forces further west in Morocco and Algeria. Morocco and Tunisia. And they launched what was called Operation Torch just a couple of weeks later, November 8th, 1942. And so right here in Morocco, Algeria, the U.S. forces landed. And so you can see, if the British forces are here, the U.S. forces are here, the squeeze that they were able to put on the German forces, and it worked. So as the U.S. forces moved here, British forces moved across North Africa there, they squeezed the Germans out of North Africa. So now we've got the tide turning in North Africa. Well, let's turn our attention to the fighting going on between Germany and the Soviet Union in the Eastern Front. So if you remember, the Russian winter stopped the advance of the Germans there at Leningrad, in the capital of Moscow, and that was the only thing that really stopped the Germans. But jump ahead to the summer, and Germany picked up its fighting again, and they turned their attention to the Caucasus Mountains region, which was rich in resources and oil, and to the Soviet city of Stalingrad. Now, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time was Joseph Stalin. So you know, if he's got a city named after him, he ain't gonna let that city go easily. And so here's the Caucasus Mountain regions and the city of Stalingrad. And some fierce fighting happened there in the city of Stalingrad. It looked like the Russians were going to have to surrender there. But the Russian winter hit. And the Germans that had actually occupied the city were now trapped by Russian soldiers or Soviet soldiers outside of the city itself. And the Germans there, frostbitten, starving, were forced to surrender. Significant victory for the Allies and the Soviets. And from that point forward, the Soviets were able to push the German forces back westward into Poland. So the German forces surrendered and the Russian forces began to push west. Thank goodness for the Russian winter, right? So now we got North Africa. We got the Eastern Front. Now they begin to turn their attention up to the underbelly or to Italy. And the Allied forces launched an attack on Sicily, July 10th, 1943. So they had taken North Africa, and now this island off the mainland coast of Italy, they attacked in 1943 and then began to push further north. While Italy surrendered in September, Germans weren't going to take that line down, so they actually moved into northern Italy since Italy surrendered. The Allies were to march all the way to Rome by June of 44, and fighting continued there in northern Italy through 1945. But the Italian leader, Benito Mussolini, was actually executed in April of 1945. And so it looked like the tide had turned as the Allied forces marched further northward. So they pushed in from the east, they got North Africa, and now they're pushing in from Italy. So the only other front is the Western Front, right? Along the French-German border. And so let's turn our attention to what would be called DDay. The Allies began to gather a huge force, fighting force of thousands of planes, ships, tanks, landing craft, 3 million plus troops to launch an attack from Great Britain onto mainland France. Well, if they're mounting this kind of force, you know that the enemy is going to be aware of some of these things going on. And Hitler knew that there was going to be an attack. He just didn't know when or exactly where. And so to kind of throw him off, the Allies launched what was called Operation Fortitude, which was basically a fake operation. They built tons and tons of these fake tanks, fake planes. They sent fake communications that they allowed to be intercepted by the Germans to kind of throw them off. Fake troop movements to kind of throw the Germans off on where and when this attack would occur. Give you an idea as we zoom in here. Germany felt sure that this little area right here, the smallest part along the English Channel, would be where the Allies launched their attack. When in reality, the Allies launched further west into a less heavily fortified area of France called Normandy. And it was there, this is a picture of one of the tanks of Operation Fortitude, 4 dudes holding up a tank. You know that thing ain't real, right? But if I'm a plane flying over and I see all of these tanks, well, I think that that's a force ready to fight. Operation Overlord. This would be the attack on the beaches of France, the real attack, not the fake one, but the real one. It was the largest land and sea attack in history, and the battle took place on the beaches of France there in Normandy against these well-dug-in German defenses. Here's a picture of where France is. This is an inset map on where these attacks took place. They tried to land troops behind the enemy lines to push in from the back while they launched their sea invasion on the beaches. To give you an idea of the scope of the fighting force that came ashore, I know it's a little bit blurry, but it'll at least give you an idea of the sheer volume of troops and tanks and ships that came across the beaches at Normandy. Here's some troops pouring out of a landing vehicle onto the beaches of France there. This is actually one of the boats that the troops were on. It's called the LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel. The nickname is the Higgins boat. The reason why I bring this up is these boats were actually made just next door in New Orleans, and the guy Higgins, who this boat is named after, spent a lot of time in the shipyards in the Mobile area. Very significant to the victory there in Normandy, but also some of the fighting in the Pacific. So I wanted to show you the Higgins boat. And this is some of the troops pouring off of the Higgins boat onto the beaches there. So now we've got Allies pushing back on all fronts. So let's see how it finally ended. Allies begin to close in on Germany. We know from Italy that way, from the Soviet Union, now from the beaches of France. Led by Eisenhower and Patton, they begin to push Germany on all sides. By September of 1944, they had taken back the city of Paris, liberated France, Belgium, and Luxembourg itself. The Allies had taken back almost all of that area. And they pushed this way as the Soviet Union began to push in from the east. One last ditch effort called the Battle of the Bulge. The German Nazi forces knew that things weren't going well. And so in one last ditch effort called the Battle of the Bulge, Germany launched their what would be last significant attack. And they actually were able to push back through Luxembourg, the Ardennes, some of these U.S. and British forces. But the forces were able to regroup and push them back, and that was the beginning of the end for the German forces. And so as the Allied forces closed in from both sides, Hitler himself saw the end, and on April 30th, 1945, he committed suicide. And just a few days later, on May 9th, which we just celebrated the 75th anniversary of this date, on May 9th, 1945, the Allies declared that VE, or Victory in Europe Day. So the tide turned in Europe. What about the Pacific? So the Allies began to advance in the Pacific first. After the attack at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. especially wanted some get back, right? And so even though they didn't have all their naval forces rebuilt just yet, they knew something had to be done. So in April 1942, they launched what was called the Doolittle Raid. And they launched B-25 bombers off of aircraft carriers and just bombed some Japanese cities, including the capital of Tokyo. Here's a picture of the Doolittle Raid from the aircraft carriers. They actually landed in Russia and what would be mainland China. And even though this is a picture of Doolittle and his forces, his men. Even though it didn't do any significant damage for real, it was a psychological victory, knowing that Japan was not unbeatable. They can be attacked. And so after this Doolittle Raid, The naval forces begin to rebuild. And let's look at some significant battles in the Pacific real quick. First was the Battle of Coral Sea. The Japanese wanted to push further south into New Guinea. And this was the first example of this new warfare where the ships didn't really fight each other. They actually launched airplanes from the carriers, and the planes would fight each other and fight the ships instead of the ships fighting themselves. Even though this wasn't a victory for the Allies, it definitely stopped Japan's southward advance. So if we look down here, here's New Guinea, here's the Battle of Coral Sea. This is a picture of some of the planes that fought during that battle. So it stopped Japan's southward advance. Battle of Midway. There was a key U.S. airfield there. Japan sent a huge naval force. U.S. found out about the plan. They actually allowed the Japanese to attack, and then once those planes came off the Japanese ships, the U.S. launched an attack on those ships from their aircraft carriers as well. And this became the turning point in the war. Let me show you kind of where Midway is. Here's Midway Island, here's Hawaii to kind of give you some perspective, Japan over here. And as the Japanese came in and launched their planes to attack Midway Islands down here, the U.S. forces right here launched their air attacks against the ships and were able to impose a significant defeat on the Japanese forces there. And this was the turning point in this Pacific. A new strategy emerged called the island hopping strategy. Small islands were scattered over these vast distances. We don't want to go island to island, but can we skip those strongholds and go to these islands that are not as well defended but are closer to Japan? If you look at the Pacific, all these little dots represent individual islands. I don't need to go to all of them. Can I skip some and get closer to Japan? And the first place this strategy was used was called the Battle of Guadalcanal. On August 7, 1942, Japanese were building an air base. There was some fierce fighting there. And from this battle on, the Japanese began to retreat. Here's the Battle of Guadalcanal. Here's some pictures, again, of the soldiers there at the Battle of Guadalcanal. Then the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Allies were on the advance. There was a gulf right off the coast of the Philippines. Said MacArthur was going to be back. He wasn't lying. He was back. He came back, and the Japanese gambled their entire Pacific fleet, and that gamble turned out not in their favor, and they lost. And so the Japanese naval fleet was essentially gone. All that was left was the Japanese army and the kamikaze pilots. Here's the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Here's MacArthur coming back like he said he was. And then all that was left was these Japanese kamikaze pilots. Kamikaze means divine wind. They were willing to sacrifice their lives, commit suicide by running their planes into key U.S. targets like a battleship. The Battle of Iwo Jima, as they pushed in further towards Japan, March of 1945, intense fighting on this island. But the reason I want to bring it up is there's a significant photo. If you notice Iwo Jima, we're getting closer and closer to Japan itself. There's this big hill on the island of Iwo Jima. This is what it looks like today. One of the most famous, iconic photographs of World War II was the U.S. soldiers placing this flag at the top of that hill there on the island of Iwo Jima. And then the Battle of Okinawa, closer and closer. Japan lost about 100,000 men, U.S. 12,000, and now we're right on the edge of Japan. Here's the Battle of Okinawa. We're right there. So, look, this is what we're going to do. We didn't get quite as far as I would have liked, but now the choice is, do we invade mainland Japan or not? And the answer eventually was not. And so we made the decision to drop the atomic bomb. So as we wrap up World War II, and next time we're going to wrap it up with this, but also look at some of the consequences. Things like we don't want to skip over the Holocaust. one of the most significant things that happened in World War II. And obviously look at some of the significant immediate costs and impact and consequences of World War II, but also some of the more long-term ones as well. So look forward to seeing you next week for our last of 6 lessons in 9th grade world history. Thank you very much.